Hello, we're going to go through chapter 9 now. Chapter 9 is on communication and relational dynamics. So this is going to be focusing on your relationships and what you can do to help maintain your relationships in a positive way and what you might need to look for if things are starting to create conflict in your relationship. I'm sure as you know, there are a lot of things that go into why a couple would get divorced. And those factors could range from the age of their children, to finances, to the age that they were married. And perhaps it's their religion, and perhaps it's where they are in the country. Each of those different variables have been studied for divorce statistics, and there are things that feed into each of them. The one that's probably the most pertinent to you has to do with age and age that you're married and what percentage of that 50-50 overall divorce statistic that age would play into getting a divorce. So let's go through a couple of different ages. We know that under 20 years old, if you get married under the age of 20 years old, women will have a 27.6% of that 50% attributed to age, and men will have 11.7%. The reason that there's such a difference between that has to do with the fact that not very many men get married when they are younger than 20 years old. The next is 20 to 24 years old, which is really the most common age, especially for the area of Snow College and that population. And the divorce statistics for that is one of the highest as far as attributing to the 50-50 divorce rate statistic. And it's 36.6% for women and 38.8% of men. And now that you've learned about things like identity development and self-concept and how that forms around the age and solidifies around the age of 24 or 25, we can kind of understand why the divorce statistic would be higher for that age generation. So that for a lot of people that are getting married then, the frontal lobe hasn't fully solidified, and knowing who they are, they've started on the journey but perhaps haven't gone to the point of really understanding who they are and how they think and what they want out of life. So in fact, I've read some things about why the under 20 years old would be better, and they say that it literally is because we are so formative when we are younger that when we get married at such a young age, we will form with the other person. We're more likely to do that when we're younger versus when we start to get older. So 20 to 24 is the highest of the age groups. And then you go to 25 to 29, which drops down to 16.4% for women and 22.3% of men. And what we find in this age group is that generally schooling has been completed, people understand themselves, and they understand what they want out of life. So they have a good idea of the type of job that they want, the places that they want to live in. They probably lived in different places by then. So finding someone that matches with who they really are is more likely. 20 to 24, when you don't really know exactly who you are, what your preferences are, you could find a mismatch, and that becomes evident when you both develop into those individual people that you were becoming but maybe hadn't become quite yet. So 30 to 34 years old, it drops again. There, you're at 8.5% and 11.6%. This has to do with financial stability that comes in during those ages, as well as having a lot of different types of relationships and experiences to kind of evaluate that marriage before you decide to tie the knot. And then 35 to 39 years is 5.1% and 6.5%. In Utah, the median marriage age is 26 for women and 28 for men. So we do, as I know at Snow College especially, people think that the average age would be 21 because so many of our student population get married at that age. But the state of Utah is still higher, as is the national average. So what we know is that in characteristics of personal relationships, the best relationships are going to include three things. And this is what I teach my class every semester and try to really drill into their minds as a point of something that they will never forget, because any positive personal relationship is going to need these things to thrive, and that's really the key to look for before you decide to form a personal relationship with someone in like a marriage. So the three things that they need to include is explanatory ability, predictive ability, and uniqueness. So explanatory ability means that you can explain somebody else's behavior. If something happened, you'd be able to look at it and diagnose what probably happened and why. And you could explain accurately to another human being what was happening with this person and with that situation. And obviously, you can't explain someone's behavior until you understand it really well. When you understand it, then you can be accurate in that explanation. The next is predictive ability. So not only would you be able to explain something that had happened, but you could look at a scenario and predict how that person will most likely behave. And that, again, predictive ability only comes after observing that person multiple times, being able to explain them correctly, and then understanding the way that the situation would affect that person. So it takes having a lot of different types of experiences with them before you'll ever be able to explain something or predict anything. Often when we're dating, we have experiences with the person that are positive, but they tend to be in one particular vein, and we stay away from things that are more difficult or where there might be contention. Well, when we don't have experiences in all of those different avenues, then it makes it really hard to have and be able to see that you have these characteristics of a positive personal relationship that is something worth committing to. So explanatory ability, predictive ability, both which take a lot of time in order to be able to generate accuracy with. And then the third thing was uniqueness. And again, uniqueness is something that's comparison based. You can't tell that something's unique unless you've been able to see different differences in people, differences in experiences or events, things like that. So it takes time in order to develop uniqueness. So you can probably see how these three things would be useful before you decided to get married, but they also are useful tools in understanding how you will stay married. So people drift apart. I'm sure you've heard that all the time, and often when that occurs, it's because one of these three things is falling to the side. So perhaps in your marriage you're not seeing how it is this unique and special relationship because you've got other relationships with other people that are just as meaningful. So that uniqueness kind of falters. Or perhaps you start having other sorts of experiences with this person and you literally did not see their behavior coming. So you don't have predictive ability. You don't know how they're going to respond or why they would have responded in a certain situation. So you can see how having these three things, not only when you first form your relationship, but also to help you maintain and know if you're in a healthy relationship, it's important to be able to understand each of them individually. So the next thing we're going to go through is why we form relationships in the first place. And this will not only be why we form them in the beginning, but it's also going to be when you're in a relationship with somebody, why you might form a relationship with somebody else, or what you will need to keep that relationship solid. So the first is appearance, and we know that definitely during the early stages of the relationship, especially, appearance is a big deal. So this is why during the dating phase, people really put a lot of effort into their looks. I'm sure you've seen on the movies where the guys are doing the push-ups right before they go to the door to get the girl, and things like that are kind of more important during those early stages. Although appearance is also something that will always play into why we would form a relationship, and that goes to attraction. So we need to feel attracted to the person that we're with. So even after 40 years of marriage, you still need to be attracted to your spouse. If you're not attracted to your spouse, chances are you'll get attracted to someone else, because that is always going to be a part of why we're forming relationships. The second is similarity. We tend to like people who are similar to us, and this has to do with our egos overall. So because we have that self-serving bias and we like things and we can usually treat ourselves better than we treat other people, in our minds at least, we tend to like people who are also similar to us. So we found that people will tend to marry others with similar names. They will tend to come from similar backgrounds, different socioeconomic status tends to be similar, those types of things. And it's just a similarity. We like people who are like us. The third is complementarity. So we like people who also complement us. So they may have a strength or something that we don't have, but we view that strength as something that helps us become better or helps us become more. It complements us in some way. The fourth is reciprocal attraction, and especially during the early stages of a relationship, we have a tendency to like people just because they like us. And this is definitely not giving anybody a stalker card to just go after somebody and continue to like them even if they say that they don't like them. But it is true that it does generally wear you down, and especially in early stages of relationships, you will tend to like someone just because they like you, because they've shown you that. And that it's a way to kind of boost the ego of sorts. And the reason that it only lasts during the early stages of a relationship for the most part is because we learn more things about them. So just liking me would probably not be enough for me to form a relationship with you in the long term. So, and that's the type of processing that most of us have. Competence is the fifth, and we do like people who we view as being competent, either in subject matter, in something that relates to the mind or to the body or nutrition. There can be a lot of different degrees of competency and different avenues for where we would find that. But whatever we think is competent as a person, we tend to look for other people who have that, and then we will think that they are more attractive and want to form a relationship with them. Disclosures is the sixth, and with disclosures, especially when you keep into mind terms like reciprocity and timing, that can be something that fosters positive relationships. So what this would mean is that disclosure, of course, remember, is when we open up about ourselves into a deeper layer of our self, like where we are. So the breadth and depth, you consider all the different subjects that you have, and then you go deeper into the subjects, which becomes a deeper layer or level of self-disclosure. And reciprocity means that we would notice that the other people are replying in kind. So as you go deeper into your self-penetration onion of sorts, which we learned in the second chapter, as you go deeper into the layers, if they respond in a way that also goes to a similar depth, that would be called reciprocity, and it would show you that they are feeling like a similar amount of affection towards you. Timing is important because sometimes it's too much too soon, sometimes it's too late, so you have to be kind of careful with self-disclosure so that the timing is appropriate and right for you to form the relationship. The seventh is proximity. We like people just because they are close to us in space. This is the one that makes me the most nervous out of any of them, because it tells us that we are more apt to forming a relationship just because that person is in our general proximity. And I think that just leaves a lot up to chance. So for example, if you were to live in an apartment complex going to college, chances are you would form a relationship with somebody who's in a similar apartment building or who has gone to the same types of classes that you have, and just because you're around that person, you'll form a relationship with them. It also makes me nervous because this is why people would form relationships with those other than their spouses after they're married. Just because you're in close proximity with someone, working with them, or whatever sort of studying that's happening, you are more likely to form a relationship with that person. So you have to just be wary of it and be aware that that's something that could come up. The last is the social exchange theory and the rewards. And the social exchange theory says that at the end of the day, what you're going to do is take your costs and whatever the relationship is costing you, and you're going to minus that from what you're getting out of it. So what your rewards are. Rewards minus the cost equals the outcome. So if your cost is more than your rewards, if it's taking more from you than you're getting back from the relationship, you will tend to get out of that relationship because it's just not worth it. It's like a bank account. Once you go into the red, it's hard to stay in the red. So if the cost is less than the rewards, and at the end of the day, whatever you have to give for that relationship, you're still getting more, you will tend to stay in the relationship. So that's something for why we would form the relationship in the beginning, and then also what we would need to keep in mind to maintain it on a positive level. So now I'm going to go through the stages of relational development. This is a model that was created by a researcher named Knapp, and it's widely used in social fields, so social work, psychology, any of those human type of fields, as a way to kind of provide a key for understanding what's going on in your relationship. So similar to how, like when you were in biology, maybe you saw a cell structure, and you had to learn the different parts of the cell structure so that you understood what was happening in a different environment or instance where the cell is stressed or the cell gets food or whatever, and how changes happen within that cell structure and goes to a different sort of level because of what is going on, what's feeding it. So the stages of relational development, this key works in a similar way. It's a model, but it helps you understand and be able to diagnose where your relationship is at and why it's probably at that particular stage. So it provides a key so that you can understand those different elements that are feeding into it, and it also helps you understand what you would need to add to it so you could get to a different level to change your overall relationship structure to be something a little bit more positive. So let's go through each of these individually. There's 3 different categories in this model. So you have the coming together stage, you have the relational maintenance stage, and you have the coming apart stage at the end. The 3 steps in the coming together stage include initiating, experimenting, and intensifying. So initiating is when you just go up and shake the person's hand, say what your names are, and engage in those very small talk sorts of conversations. So during the initiating phase, it's where you decide if you want to pursue things further and actually ask perhaps deeper types of questions, or if it's just a very brief sort of social encounter. So the second phase is the experimenting phase. If you start having small talk with someone and you learn that you enjoy that conversation with them, that it's somehow unique and you're finding yourself going beyond those cliches that usually happen with small talk into more genuine information, you probably are ready to experiment with them somehow, either by going deeper into your self-disclosure or perhaps going on a date. It could mean a lot of different things. So within our culture, there's a huge variance depending on your age and where you live in the United States of America for what experimentation would mean. In some places, experimenting could literally mean a one-night stand, and that would be on the same level as what someone else might say a first date with or without even a peck on the cheek. So that could mean experimenting to someone where a one-night stand means the same amount. And what's hard about experimenting is that you don't always know the stage that the other person is viewing it to be. So for example, I might view kissing on a first date as being something that is experimenting, but someone else might view that as something they save for perhaps the next stage, which is intensifying. So perhaps they don't kiss on the first through 4th date or something, just because they're waiting until they know that this is a more serious relationship and something that is intensifying and means more. So it has a lot to do with the person, and it has a lot to do with the other in the relationship for what stage it would be at. So I think I've defined experimenting, but intensifying, let me give you a little bit more on. During the intensification phase, we usually find ourselves with like the rose-colored glasses. So it's really hard to see somebody's flaws during an intensification phase. We'll just see their benefits, and it's not until, later on in the relationship where we are able to see kind of the more realistic perspectives of this person, or perhaps even after the relationship has ended. You'll notice that things like appearance become really important, laughing at all the jokes, very little conflict. It's kind of the honeymoon phase of sorts. And I always tell people, be very wary during this stage. It's great to have it, and you need to have this kind of overall push towards love, which is what the honeymoon phase and these rose-colored perspectives give you. But don't think that that's an accurate snapshot of what your marriage is going to be like. That's not even in the relationship maintenance circle. It's in intensifying, because it's not, it's in coming together, because it's not even really real yet. So it's a perspective of the most rosy colored real, but it's not real. So intensification is a fun phase to go through, but when you start to notice that you are fighting and that you don't have to pretend all the time with your appearance, maybe you let, whatever it is, you let your guard down on certain things, then actually you're getting out of intensifying to a more positive stage, which is integrating. Integrating is the bottom of the circle for relationship maintenance. And during an integration phase, that's when like your friends and your family start to intertwine, or you go to the other person's house. You see them in real contexts. So it's no more just about the positive and the fun and just like that flood of love. It's also about the other emotions that a person would have and dealing with those. So it's about sadness, working out sadness and anger and fear. And during the integrating phase, you get to really see how the other person is interacting and what you could do or have done to help them and to like be a we in those sorts of situations instead of just handling them on your own. So a lot of people during the integration phase will have move-in sort of mentality where they operate as a couple when they're invited to parties and stuff. It's we are going to go. It's not me and you so much, which still will happen during an intensification phase. So integration is just kind of assumed that you would be together. And then if you go up one, then you're to bonding. And bonding would mean that you make some sort of social acknowledgement of your relationship being together, so that you have bonded. It's visible through marriage, obviously, but you don't have to have marriage to be bonded. There are a lot of lifetime partners who just make this statement to each other. And it's just as lasting and important. But it's a different step up from just integration. So integration and boyfriend, girlfriend, dating sort of environment, even if you're kind of move-in sort of mentality during that integration, the bonding step will be different from that, with or without marriage. So bonding is the epitome of we. It's you and that person together in perspective, in activity, in all that you do. On the opposite side, but equal in height, which means that they are both equally positive, is differentiating. So bonding isn't the ultimate. It's actually bonding and differentiating, which is the ultimate for a relationship. Differentiating means that instead of being me, you go towards I, or instead of being we, you go towards me. Differentiating means that instead of being we, you go over towards me. So bonding is we, differentiating is me or I. And both are extremely important. There's an analogy of two trees growing. And if they grow by each other with their roots planted down and all too close, their roots will intertwine, and usually what happens is they compete for the sunlight. So one will grow and kind of become interdependent on the other. They aren't as strong as they would be if you give them individual and independent root systems and give them enough space so that they can feel the sunlight equally. That's the best case scenario, and actually with two trees growing up together, they'll be able to provide support to each other and have a longer chance of survival. So that's kind of the analogy for bonding and differentiating. In your relationships, and especially your marriages, you want to spend time equal between those two. So you go from bonding to differentiating and back and forth, where you're doing work on yourself and you're doing work as a couple. And that somehow becomes a balance act to create this overall maintenance that keeps your relationship healthy and keeps you healthy. One step down from differentiating, but still in that relationship maintenance circle, is called circumscribing. And circumscribing can be thought of as the opposite of integrating. Whereas integration is kind of the living together sort of mentality, circumscribing is the living apart. So you are probably still married in this stage, hanging out together and such, but you'll find yourself going not just to somehow bolster the me or the I in you, which is the differentiation. You start to go into looking for opportunities to make yourself different. So, and that's completely different than just strengthening and being an individual. So when you start to consciously look for things that make you different or allow you to be away from, then you're starting to circumscribe. So instead of coming together as boyfriend, girlfriend, you're exploring ways that you could go apart. And that's important to recognize. It's part of it. You're still in the relationship circle. It's totally fine. It's just you don't want to spend too much time circumscribing. If you are consciously making efforts to be away from that person, you probably need to get back over to bonding and explore what your relationship would be like as you come together and explore the we mentality a little bit more so that you can get back up to the balance between just bonding and differentiating instead. When we go down to these last 3 steps, it's to the coming apart stage in Knapp's relationship cycle. So these 3 steps are really signals for you that something is going completely awry in your relationship. And if you want to fix it, you're probably going to need to do some active measures because it won't just fix on its own. So the first is stagnating. Whereas in circumscribing, you're just actively looking for ways to be apart. In stagnation, you are just kind of still in that measurement. So it doesn't make you anxious to be apart. It doesn't make you want to be back together. If they're gone or they stay here, it doesn't really matter. People in stagnation sometimes sleep in different rooms, for example, or just will say things like the love in their marriage, the love has gone out of their marriage, or it's somehow deflated. It's changed, or perhaps they view each other as friends more than lovers. And those types of words with a stagnation in a relationship, like a marriage relationship, that's a sign that you're coming apart. People can live in stagnation for a long time, but and somehow tolerate it, but eventually it will add to the demise of the relationship. So the step 1 down from that is avoiding. When you go beyond just being okay if you're apart, and actually like it doesn't do anything when you're together either, then you are probably going to be trying to stay away from this person so that you can have experiences with somebody else that would be rewarding. So that would be avoiding. Some people during the avoiding stage will separate, straight up separate, move to different houses, apartments, states, whatever it takes, but really create that break in perspective so that you can start to see how you operate on your own. So it's not just like looking for opportunities or being okay when those opportunities exist. You are now actively seeking and living in a different reality. So notice how it's opposite of experimenting. So whereas on the other side of coming together, experimenting, you were doing things to see if there might be a spark. On this coming apart with avoiding, you could be doing things to see if you would be okay on your own. So and then the last stage is terminating. And just like initiating is coming up and shaking your hands, saying hello, termination is like that, but saying goodbye. So it doesn't have to be a drawn out process. It is for a lot of people. It takes a long time to sign those divorce papers, but it doesn't have to be. Termination can be something that couples do pretty quickly because they've spent so much time in the stagnation and avoiding that by the time they get to terminating, they're ready to do it. So with this cycle, it doesn't mean that we all go through each steps one by one. And I'm sure that you know people who meet someone and get married after, 3 weeks or 3 months. And in those instances where they haven't had enough time to really go through an intensification or integration phase, then yeah, they did probably move really quickly up to a bonding without experiencing those other steps. And when that happens, usually we have to go back down and somehow work through the issues. So if you get married and you decide to just go to Vegas, for example, on a weekend and elope to someone that you don't know very well, you would probably have gone on a whim during your experimenting phase. And then you come back and you're married, so you've gone to experimenting and bonding, but now you need to somehow see if you even like this person. So intensification. You want to see what that flood of love feels like, and you probably will find yourself dressing up still and just focusing on their strengths and stuff and ignoring the flaws, all of that. And then the integration phase is still going to have to happen as well. So you will have to meet each other's friends. You're going to have to go and see how you mix with their family. And even if you're married, you're going to have to go through that and somehow see if it's a positive fit or not. So that's why people would suggest that you take time. Take time going through, make sure that you have those 3 things that I talked about before: explanatory ability, predictive ability, and uniqueness. If you have those 3 things, you've spent enough time in these first 5 steps of initiating, experimenting, intensifying, and integrating to know that you're ready to be bonded together. So there's a lot that goes into marriage, and this relationship development cycle actually works not just for marriages, it works for friendships, it works for boss and employee relationships, parent-child. Every relationship that you have will have an independent circle for you that goes through this cycle. So in a friendship, obviously, like when you're bonded and differentiation, that's going to be different than your spouse, right? That's a different kind of bonding, but it still has similar things with all of them, and we work through our relationships again and again using this sort of model. There's another model to be aware of, and this relates to conflict and conflict resolution. This has to do with your dialectical perspective. So there's a term called dialectical tension, and what this means is that we tend to have a struggle to manage conflicts, and we'll see these conflicts as being somehow incompatible forces. So the dialectical tension is the struggle between these incompatible forces that's creating a conflict. There's three different types of dialectical tensions that you'll see in relationships. Connection versus autonomy is the first, openness versus privacy is the second, and predictability versus novelty is the third. So in connection versus autonomy, this is basically the top of Knapp's cycle. It's the bonding versus differentiating. So connection versus autonomy. Connection would be bonding, autonomy would be differentiation. And as you struggle between those two forces, you usually see a little bit of conflict. And I always encourage people with conflict that if you can view it as natural and beneficial, then you're going to get through it in a positive manner. If you view the conflict as negative and scary, then it will tend to put too much force on it and cause other issues. So the second is openness versus privacy. This is the tension that happens when we're trying to decide how much information to share and about what and when. So if you remember back in the Johari window, there's information that we do try to keep hidden from other people, and there's information that's blind and unknown, as well as information that's open. So that tension of knowing how to bring out information with self-disclosure, how much you should be talking through, and what's helpful for your relationship tends to be a little bit of a tension. Not to mention things even with bodily functions, like do you go to the bathroom at the same time or have someone have a shower while you're going to the bathroom, things like that. You have to work out how to create physical boundaries of privacy as well as emotional and intellectual boundaries. So the third is predictability versus novelty. That's a tension that goes between feeling like you need to have things change and that they are unique, and also feeling like things are pretty stable and predictable. And that tension tends to come up throughout your relationship as well. So where it's nice to be stable with someone and know that you can count on them, you also need to feel that excitement and like you're getting energized because you're around them or because your relationship exists. So that's the predictability versus novelty tension. Going through tensions in a relationship isn't necessarily going to be the funnest thing that you've ever done, but it is something that can help you grow stronger. So if you approach the idea of conflict as something that will benefit you in the long run, that's usually the best case scenario. So what I presented today is just the start of the chapter. The rest of the chapter goes through how to manage the dialectical tensions as well as transgressions that might happen in your relationship. So I would encourage you to read the other sections very carefully and be thinking about your own relationships and what you've noticed that the chapter concepts relate to. Try to put some of the concepts into effect if you can. Maybe it's that you need to work on Knapp's relationship cycle and recognize that you're engaged in some stagnation, or maybe it's that you're going through some sort of a novelty versus predictability issues. Start to recognize what is going on, and usually if you'll use a little bit of meta communication, which is the last concept of the book, and actually start talking about the communication that you need to use in order to deal with your issues. So communication about communication is what meta communication is. That can usually help us start to discover and find what the real issues are, and the best way about going through that conflict or that issue. So I will see you back here for chapter 10. Thanks.